Now we're on Daf Lamed Daled Amud Beis. Hani Avto de Taye. If you remember, the word Taye refers to these merchants that used to travel from place to place, and now we're talking about Avta. Avta are these leather containers or canteens. Basa Tracy Yarchishata Shari. Once again, although I assume that these travelers have stored their wine in these canteens, nevertheless, there is some minimum shirayim, a leftover taste of wine in the leather canteens, and therefore you wait the 12 months, or alternatively, you change the water where it's soaking every 24 hours. Omer of Acha Breder Avika. Hani Purtse de Aramoy. Again, we're back to the Armenians, and they have a certain extraction that they take out from the grapes. He calls it pomace, which I didn't get a chance to look it up, but I think pomace is a kind of like a hard, rocky substance. Basa Tracy Achishata, sorry, again, we wait out to 12 months. Omer of Acha Berei Rava, again, a fifth case now of waiting out to 12 months. Hani Gulfe Shchime Viuchme, Basa Tracy Achishata. So these are red and black jugs of the idol worshippers. And apparently, since we already said that these various vessels that were used by the Ovdei Kochavim for Yayin are mutter after 12 months, here too, we're going to apply the 12-month rule, but the chiddush here of Rav Acha Breder Rava is that we're talking about red and black jugs, which means that they are discolored. And the reason why they get discolored, according to the law of physics, is because of the extensive use and storage of yayin nesa. So you might think that in this case, you need a real hechsher. You got to get rid of that blia. Kamashmala, no. Since it was, again, bitzonen, therefore all you need is to wait to 12 months. Okay, now we're going to talk about fish. And specifically a fish that's called murias. Now, the English translation here of murias is sultanis. Okay, sultanis is a very small fish, and they sold it in very large quantities. Just one second. I may have jumped ahead of myself for a second here. Oh, just one second. So the two categories of fish that we're going to address now in this brisa, one is called murias and the other is called chilik. So what is murias? It's a non-kosher fish. And now the problem is that this murias is a concoction that's made out of this non-kosher fish together with wine. They used to mix wine in it. We'll see in a minute why they did that, to mix wine in it. Now, there are people who work in the business of manufacturing murias and they sell it on the market. They don't want to mix wine into it. Why? Because the wine has a detrimental effect on the murias. Now, when they prepared this murias, this murias was filled with fat, like an oily substance, and they had to sort of extract that oil. So what did they do? They did something called steeping in English. What is steeping? They would mix it with water and salt, and that would draw out the excess fat. And they would do the steepings not once, not twice, but thrice. In the first two stages, since the fish is still very high in fat content, the wine that they add is not going to do well. It reacts badly with the high fat content and ruins the quality of the murias. And therefore, the Brisi says, Murias Uman, Murias that you purchase from a professional Murias manufacturer, is mutter, and that means it's mutter on the first two steepings. Because we can assume at this point, when the fish is full of fatty oils, they're not going to add wine. The mixture of wine with fatty oils is explosive, if I could use that word, meaning it's very detrimental. However, if Murius is produced by a non-professional, meaning a private person, he doesn't care so much about the quality of the Murius. He's not selling it on the market, and therefore he wants to, what's the word I want to use? He wants to expand the size of the Murius, stretch it, so to speak. And since Murius is more expensive than wine, he's going to stretch it, fatten it up by adding wine. And even though, as we said before, when the fish is full of fats, the wine doesn't interact very well with the oils of the fish, but nevertheless, he's not selling it professionally. He just wants to beef up the amount that he's eating or giving to his family or his guests or whatever else. So therefore, we have to worry about the add mixture of wine in the case of a private person. But in the case of a professional, at least at the early stages of manufacturing Murius in the first two steepings, then we can assume there's no wine added because that's going to ruin the taste of the fish and he won't be able to sell. Rav Yehuda ben Gamliel, Omer Shema Chanina ben Gamliel, Af Chilek Uman Mut. And now we get to that fish that we said before is called sultanas. And sultanas is a species of fish that in its immature state, it does not have snapir v'kaskes, it doesn't have fins and scales, but later on, it develops them. And again, there's an issue here about the kashrus of sultanas. Right, today not today, but 50 years ago, there's a whole issue about the swordfish, whether it's kosher or not. But this sultanas fish is very unique in the sense that it has simone kashrus, but only develops it later on in its life. Now, as we said before, this is a very small fish that comes in quantities, and they sold it, by the major barrels. And the Mishnah says you're not allowed to eat chilik if it was sold by an idolater, because there are non-kosher fish that look almost the same, and you won't be able to identify them. So you're going to begin to eat this massive quality of chilak, and lo and behold, what's in the chilak? There is a mixture of non-kosher fish. So the Brisa tells us that in the case of a professional fisherman who's selling his fish, in this case, sultanas fish, chilak, on the market, you don't have to worry about the admixture of non-kosher fish, because number one, he is the expert and he can identify the difference between this fish, the sultanas, and non-kosher fish. And number two, he has vested interest in doing so, right? And the reason for that might be one of two things, either because he wants to sell the fish to Jews, and that expands his market, or because the non-kosher fish have an unpleasant taste, and that would be transmitted to the chilek if he mixes them together. Tani avimi bereid Rabbi Abo Murias Uman Mutter. Okay, fine. That we said until now, that the professional, while he's doing the first two steepings, he doesn't add wine because it doesn't mix with this thick and substantive quantity of oil. Hutani lavu amala. But now he wants to add what we've been saying all along, because I knew this Gemara, but not because I had it before. And he says, Pam Rishon v'Sheni Mutter. He does not add any wine into the manufacturing of Murius on the first and two steepings, because, as we said before, it's so full of oil. But Shlishi also, if he's selling you Murius on the third round of steeping. Again, I'm not exactly sure how you know this, but maybe there were signs or whatever. Then it's also because at that point there's such a limited quantity of fatty oils that it's worth it for him to add wine. And you buy the fish by weight, so you stretch it out and you get more for your buck. My time upon Rishon V'Sheni Nofeshum Nayu, there's so much fat. Is lo tzorich lemimri lehu chamra. He's not going to throw and mix into this concoction any wine because wine is going to be detrimental. But mikan v'elech ramu bo chamra. Once he gets to the third steeping of this fish, at that point, he's going to add wine. And apparently the fish, not only does it have a limited amount of oil, but it begins to give off a unsavory flavor or odor, and the wine somehow counteracts that unsavory smell. So therefore, the Murius now, from the third steeping and on, is also because there's a mixture of wine. Hahu Arva, there was a boat. The Murs Yosya Osi Lidamile de Akko, and it somehow banked at the port of Akko, and it had what was its cargo? It was full of Murias. Osiv Rabbi Abba min Akko to Tori Bador. Rabbi Abba came from Akko, set guards to make sure that the manufacturers, once the docked at the port of Akko, would not add any wine. Amalei Rav, I don't get it. Ad ha'idna man natra. I mean, this ship came from, across the seas with all this Murius in it, and how do you know that there was no admixture of wine on the boat on the way? Amalei, so Rabbi Abba defended himself, and he says, Ad ha'idna l'may nechush. There's nothing to be worried about until this point. Now it becomes a problem. Why? If you're going to tell me that maybe the Murius on the third steeping, the Goyim, they added wine. No. They didn't add wine. Why not? Because wine is more expensive than Murius. We said before that Murius is commands a very high price. But Kista, which is a certain measurement of Murius, Bluma, you can sell it for 1 Luma, a coin. Let's say, I don't know if it's 50 shekel. But Kista de Chamra, but the same exact volume of wine, Bi'arba resells for 400% of that price. So wine is so relatively expensive compared to Murius that it doesn't make sense for him on a business level to add wine to the Murius. He's just going to suffer a loss. But now the problem is that the boat docked in Eretz Yisrael. Here in Eretz Yisrael, Baruch Hashem, we have lots of wine. Golan wine, and wine is inexpensive. And therefore, it's going to make sense that at this point, if he wants to stretch or beef up the amount of Murius that he's going to sell here in the land of Israel at the port of Akko, he's going to add wine. And therefore, Rabbi Abba said we need to set up guards, like Jews that would, supervise the idolaters and make sure that they don't add any wine. Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah l'Rab Zara Dilma Aidi Ditzur Asur Dishave Chamra. Wait a second. You know what? There are various routes in the sea, and when the ship is coming towards Akko, it might stop in a place called Tsur, which is up north, which is called Lebanon today, right? And there in Tsur, the value of wine is very low. So it's not just that in Eretz Yisrael proper, the volume of wine on the market is so great that the wine is inexpensive, but even in the outlying areas, like in the north there in Lebanon, there also wine is inexpensive. So maybe this ship went through Lebanon. There he bought an amount of wine that per volume is less expensive than the Murius, and he added the wine to the Murius. Amalei, this is brilliant. I, I get in this Paul when I see that the Gemara understood so much about reality, about geography and so forth and so on. Says Reb Zera, there's no chashash that they would have stopped on their way to Eretz Yisrael in Tzur. Impossible. The ships could not make it. Why? He makes a study here of the water in the ocean around Tzur. And he says that that water is coming from the mountains. It's basically melted snow, and it's full of whirlpools. You can't, what's the word I need? Not manage. You can't, you know, you can't use the oars, to propel the boat against these whirlwinds. So therefore, I know for sure they didn't stop in Tzur. My only problem is here in Eretz Yisrael when they landed in Akko, and that's where the price for wine is so inexpensive that we have to be choshesh, suspect that the idol worship is going to add wine to the murias, and therefore we have to set up guards. Now, amongst the things that the Mishnah says is prohibited from goyim is gvinas beis unyoki, cheese coming from a place called beis unyoki, which is produced by the idol worshippers. And the question is, why is this prohibited? Is there some kashrus issue with regard to non-kosher fish, non-kosher cheese? And the Gemara says, Amar of Shimon Lakish, Mipnei ma osru gvinas unki, why was it prohibited? Mipnei sherov hagolim shel osa ha'ir nishchatim lavodas kochav. This place called Beis Unyaki was full of idol worship. And they took their calves and they slaughtered them for the sake of the idols as a sacrifice to the Avoda Zara. And of course, that Tikrovus Avoda Zara is also by no, we can't benefit from it. And now they're going to take rennet from those calves and they're going to implement what we call cheese making. And the cheese, therefore, is made through the calves, which are tikrovus avodas kochav. So we're not allowed to have any hano from these gvinos. So the Gemara asks the following question: why did Rish Lakish say that rov hagolim, most calves, are slaughtered in Beis Hanyuki for the sake of a sacrifice for the idols? My area of Hagola Filu Miyut Nami Doha Rabbi Meir Chashish Lemiyuta. Rabbi Meir's shita is that in a question of Iser veheter, we have to be machmir even for a mute. I mean, obviously, the question we have to raise on Rabbi Meir, if we were studying Rabbi Meir as a separate sugya, is the Torah says, Achri Rab Malahatos, the Torah validates and recognizes Rov, but Rabbi Meir is choshesh for mute. And this has a lot to do with the laws of chazakas. So this is a major sugya in Shas, all over the place. So why do Reish Lakish have to tell me that most of the calves in Beis Hanyuki are slaughtered for the sake of Avodah Zarah? Wouldn't it be enough to say that some of the calves, even if it's a miyut, a minority, would be enough? Because Rabbi is choshesh l'miyut. So the Gemara answers, I amrit rov, if Reish Lakish had said rov, then ika miyut, then we have just a second. One second. I amrit rov. One second. Oh, okay. I didn't translate the Aramaic correctly. I amrit rov, if Reish Lakish, which in fact he did say that Rove, most of the calves are slaughtered for sacrifice, and then Ika Miut. And in totality, you only have a minority of calves that are not problematic. So that would be fine. And we understand that we're not allowed to have benefit from this cheese because it has the status of takroves avodas kochavim, and that's if there's rove. However, I amrit el I amrit miut, which means that only a minority of their calves are tikrovos avodah zarah shechted for the sake of sacrifice, is keva the ika rova golem v'ein nishchotin lavodas kochavim. So the majority of the calves then, if Reish Lakish had used the word miut, are not slaughtered for the purpose of idol worship. Ikanami sharbe moshe nishchotim lavodas kochavim. Well, forget about calves. What about other animals? So now we're going to say that a minority of the calves are slaughtered, and then you're going to add most of the other animals, right? So most of the animals, if Reish Lakish had said miuta, are not slaughtered for, and then you add to the calves most animals. So then even Rabbi Meir would say in such a case, we don't apply the principle of Chayshin al Miuta because there's a rove and another rove. Havi le Miuta de Miuta. And now each rove unto itself generates a minority. Rabbi Meir. Even Rabbi Meir says, I'm only choshesh for one miut, but not for a double miut. So therefore, Reish Lakish, if he wanted to tell you to worry about the Gvinos of Beis Unkiri because they slaughtered for Avodah Zara, he could not have said, well, most of them are slaughtered for Avodah Zara. I'm sorry, he had to say most of them were slaughtered for Avodah Zara. He couldn't say a minority was slaughtered because in this case, even Rabbi Meir would be moded that you have one miut and another miut from all the other animals. So it seems that rennet could be produced by many, many different animals, different species, not only from calves. Okay. Now we get to a real lumdish sugya. I mean, this sugya that we're about to learn is like an introduction to Maseches Zvachim. I mean, real heavy kudsh. And this is the sugya called Machash Avoda Lavoda. Reb Shimon al Yochel Reish Lakish, v'chi nishchatim lavodas kochav my havi. Even if the calves were slaughtered for the sake of use as a sacrifice, who cares? Va'at, you Reish Lakish yourself, in a machlokas between you and Rabbi Yochanan, would take the view that it's mutter. Atu d'shari. Dietmar, because we studied a machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. A shochet is beimel lizrok dama la'avodas kochavim. A man is a shochet, and imagine he has in mind that after he completes the shechita, he's going to take the blood, receive the blood, and he's going to use it as part of idolatry. And the question now is whether or not the meat of this slaughtering is avodah zara, or alternatively, lahaktir chelbel avodas kochavim, or not to, throw the blood, sprinkle the blood for avodah zara, but rather to take the chelev and burn the chelev for avodah zara, the fats. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Asura. Why? Rabbi Yochanan says, as soon as he does the shechita, we already view the shechita as if he was zorik the dam for avodah zara, or he was makter the chelev for avodah zara, and therefore the shechita itself generates an isur avodah zara. That a thought that crossed your mind, a kavanah, an intention at the point of avodah A for the purpose of avodah B, is chal already in avodah A. And even though that's halach in kodshim with regard to pnim, meaning in the Beis Hamikdash, but it applies even outside the Beis Hamikdash in Chulin. So he shechted a regular animal, and he shechted for the purpose of being zorik the dam on the mizbeach of Avoda Zara. It's already also with the shechita. Reish Lakish Amar Muteres. Why? Because Reish Lakish holds ein mechashvim avoda lavoda. Whatever machshava he had at the time of the shechita is irrelevant. It'll only become relevant when he goes ahead and implements his initial intention, his plan, and he throws the dam on the idol mizbeach. But until he does so, the shechita itself doesn't generate any iser. So therefore, the rennet that's taken after the shechita, those calves, even if they were shechted for the purpose of avodah zara, but according to Reish Lakish, your shita is ein mechash me avodah lavoda, and therefore the shechita doesn't generate a din of avodah zara, and therefore the rennet is not prohibited. Therefore the cheese should be okay. Amalei Reish Lakish responds to Reb Shimon ben Eliakim, Tramicha Shatcha. I hope you'll have better fortune down the line. Your kasha is no kasha at all. The Omer B'Gmar Zvicha Hu Ovda. The shechit itself is part of the service of Avodah Zarah. So the man had in mind, again, this idolater back in Beis Hanyuki, had in mind that the shechit itself, in its complete form, should be an act of worship for the idol. So therefore, the shechita generates the iser of tikrovas avodas kochavim. You can't have any benefit from the rennet that's used from these calves that were shechted for the purpose of avodah zara is tikrovas avodah zara. It's also barnoah, and therefore we can't eat the cheese. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Shal Rabbi Yishmael. So the Mishnah records a whole, shakla v'tarya discussion between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Yishmael about why cheese of avodas kochavim is prohibited. Omar Vachta Boy Omar Rav Hamakadesh B'Perish. Okay, so now we enter a sugya called Perish. Now, Perish takes on different meanings. There's like a generic meaning of Perish, and then there's a more specific meaning here in our sugya. But basically, the generic term Perish refers to any part of an animal that's really not part of the animal. Here, in our context, we're talking about waste products. Now, as strange as it sounds to our ears, the waste products of, for example, a shar can actually be used. You could make a little kind of utensil out of it. Again, Now, here's the overlap between Iser Veheter and Kiddushay Isha. When a man is Mekadosh and Isha, he has to give her a Shava Pruta. He has to give her something that she could benefit from. Now, they took the wastes of a shar, made it into some sort of a makeshift utensil, and he gave it to her for Kiddushin. Hamakadesh B'Peresh Shara Niskal. Now, Shara Niskal, a shar that killed a human being and stood in front of a beis of 23 judges that was condemned as a Shara Niskal, meaning it's got to be stoned. And the animal and the body of the animal after the stoning is osur b'hano. You can't have any benefit from it. So now, he took the waste products from this ox and he gave it to her as Kedusha. Mekudeshes. Billy Ploim, a tremendous revolution here. I would have said it's osur b'hano, it's worthless. But perish eglav oikachavim ain't mekudeshes. But if there were calves that were used for a sacrifice to Avodah Zarah, and he took the waste products from this calf and he gave it to her as an isha, she's not mekudesh, it's not foul. What's going on? So Gemara takes two approaches. Number one, Ibai Sema Svara. If you like, I'll explain to you the distinction between Avodah Zarah and Shara Niskal logically. Or Ibai Sema, if you don't like it, then Kra, I'll build it on Psukim. Ibai Sema Svara, if you like it based on Svara, is Gabi Egle Avodas Kochavim Nichale Bin Nifche for some reason, which again I don't know enough about idolatry to explain this, but the fatter the animal, the more volume there is, the more extension there is, it's all part of what we want to sacrifice to the idol. So therefore, the waste is considered part of the animal because the Avoda Zara wants it to be part of the animal so that it expands the animal for the sake of the idol. And therefore it has the status of Tikrovas Avodas Kochavim. And if he gives it to an Isha, it's also Bano, she cannot benefit from it, it's not Mikudeshes. But Aval Gabi Shar Niska Lo Nichale Benifche. In the case of a Shar Niskal, what difference does it make with the waste products, without the waste products? You don't have to fatten the shar for any purpose. So the waste is not considered significant. It's a separate entity. And therefore, I shouldn't say it's not significant. I should say it's not significant enough to be part of the Isser Hano that's chal on the shar. And therefore, it's not Osir Bano. It's like a separate entity. And we're going to see that when we get back to generic Peresh, it's always considered a separate entity. And we have similar sugyas with regard to nails and hooves and other extensions of the animal, whether or not they're part of the animal or they're a separate entity. We said that if you don't like the Svara to explain the difference between Avodas Kochavim and Shar Niskal, I'll give you a post. Ksiv Hacha, with regard to Avodah Zara, the Torah says, Lo Yidbak B'yodcha B'uma Min Acherem, and Ma'uma means nothing. Don't get anything from this cherem, from this band properly. And that's going to be a ribui, Ma'uma, to include even perish. But in the case of Shar Niskal, Ksiv Hasam, Shar Yisokal Hashar, V'lo Ye'achel Bisaro, and Bisaro means the flesh of the ox. And we darshan Bisaro Asur Ha Perso Mut. Amarava Travayu Taninu. The truth is that both of these approaches are formulated by the Mishnah. Are implicit in the Mishnah, I should say. The problem with cheese from idolaters is that they use it as rennet. The Rabbi Shmuel responds, "Follow kevas ola chamura mikevas nevela." The law is that the rennet that you derive from a korban ola, and ola is subject to meila, is not the rennet is not subject to meila. It's peresh, and if it's peresh, then it's not considered part of the animal as far as kajim are concerned, and therefore there's no isa meila. How much more so with a kal v'chomer should we say that it's not part of a regular animal that's not a korban ola? Michlal the isuri hana shari pirshayu. If in the case of an ola, the Torah was matir pirshayu because pirshayu, the waste products, are not considered part of the goof of behema, the chalos kachim, and the isumil is not chal, then how much more so in the case of a non-sanctified shor? Umidika amar lemit neshama midim also v'kevas egle avodas kochavim. Rabbi Shmuel replies to Rabbi Shmuel that the cheese of idol worship is prohibited because they curdle these cheese with the rennet of calves that was sacrificed to idols. And Rabbi Shmuel responds to Mikain, Lama lo asrua be'ana, it should be also be'ana, michlal d'avodas kochavim asur pirshayu, that peresh with regard to avodah zara because of the special ribui of lo yidbak b'yadcha me'uma comes to be marbe even peresh. And the svara was because the Ovdei Kochavim want to beef up the animal and they want the perish to also expand the size of the animal. So this leads us to Lehederle here on Daf Lamed He, which in Mitzvah Hashem will pick up tomorrow.